Welcome to the New Books Network.
Today on the New Books Network, we welcome Josh Cowen to discuss his book, The Privateers: How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. I'm your host, Megan Cochran. Josh Cowen is professor of education policy at Michigan State University. He has written articles on topics related to education politics, school choice, and culture wars in the United States. Professor Cowen, before we get into the details of the book, let's start a little bit with you and your background and why you decided to write this book now.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Megan, and appreciate the chance to chat about the book today. So professionally, my background is as a program evaluator, and that sounds pretty boring. What that means, though, is just I've sort of grew up in a period of time in education research that was very goal setting in terms of trying to figure out what works and why and for whom in terms of the policies and the public funding that we divert and spend on all kinds of educational programs. And that period of time for me began around school choice programs, charter schools, and school vouchers as far back as 20 years ago. So I got into this line of work just trying to figure out, do vouchers work? Do they have the impacts that their advocates say they will? Which meant that I came into this sort of research topic with pretty much of an open mind. I hadn't yet gotten into some of the more philosophical questions that we'll talk about and that I talk about in the book, but just do these things work on the standards that people have asked that they should? And as we'll see, the answer is no. And that actually gets to the second part of your question, which is why the book now. So the puzzle for me here is, okay, vouchers have caused some pretty terrible academic impacts over the last 10 years, and yet they're having a moment. They're spreading all over the country, particularly red states. So why is that? What is the answer to that puzzle? If they're not working, they haven't done what their dearest adherents have said they would, then why are they still here? And that's really what the question the book sets out to ask.
Thank you. Let's talk about that. Will you ground our audience? We have a general audience. Can you explain exactly what are vouchers? What are we talking about? What's going on?
So vouchers are any policy that sends taxpayer dollars to private school tuition. And there's a bunch of different ways that can happen. They're very technical. We can get into that, but just vouchers are programs that send public dollars to private school tuition.
Great. And so as you already talked about, you've done a lot of research around the evidence of the effectiveness of these programs.
Yeah.
So I'm very eager to get to the politics and the purposes of these programs. But first, let's focus on the evidence about those outcomes and what you learned.
Yeah. So the idea behind these voucher systems is essentially that that some children should be able to use taxpayer dollars to go to a school that their parents choose for them outside of the public education system, on the idea that the child's not getting what they need from the public school. And so the immediate question in the early days of voucher research and voucher programs in general is these things start at the same time, passing these bills in the early 90s and then asking how they're doing. In the early days, we did see that there were some children, a small number, that using small scale vouchers to transfer from a public to a private school, that they did find some academic improvements. And the places like Milwaukee, places like Cleveland, where some of the early programs were. And that was true from around 1990 until around 2002. And then we settled into a period of time from between 2002 to 2012 or so where we didn't see anything favorable, like the kids transferred using these dollars, and maybe a few more were likely to graduate. They didn't have a particular impact on academics or so, but they didn't seem to do any harm. But then over the last decade, as vouchers have grown, across the states and grown from these small pilot versions of these programs in a Cleveland or a Milwaukee to statewide systems in Arizona, in Florida, in Indiana, in Ohio, in Louisiana, and other states. We've seen some of the largest academic declines on record on any question in education, not just school choice or vouchers, but just any question. We've seen some of the largest declines on record. And the simple reason for that is that it's kind of a misconception that sort of the typical private school is better in academic terms than the typical public school. In fact, there are any number of elite private schools, but they cost well more than a voucher would pay for, and they have very selective admission. They don't take just anyone who applies. The private schools that do take kids using vouchers and do have space tend to be what I call subprime providers. They're just frankly not very good. They're often financially distressed, about to close. Sometimes they even do close once vouchers start paying some of the bills. And you see the academic results of that. Their kids go, they think that they're going to this kind of award-winning private school, and in fact, it's what I call the education equivalent of predatory lending.
Mm. I want to start going into some of the history, which I found just so riveting. So many listeners are familiar with Milton and Rose Friedman because of their work in economics. But I was interested in how Milton Friedman was so deeply involved in the history of school vouchers. Can you talk a little bit about where they came from and what was Milton Friedman's, and I'm not even sure if Rose Friedman was part of that or not, but what that role was about?
Yeah, so Rose was part of sort of the later advocacy behind it, but the general idea for vouchers did come from Milton Friedman himself in 1955 in an essay that he wrote that's widely read even today. And in this essay, The Role of Government in Education, he sort of proposed the idea of what's now called school vouchers, sending public dollars to parents to spend at what amounted to private schools. It's important to know about that time period, what else was going on at that time in 1955. This was just a few months after Brown versus Board of Education. It ruled that the segregation in public schools and other public spaces was non-constitutional. And so opposition to that ruling, segregationists primarily, but not exclusively in the South, immediately latched onto Friedman's idea as a sort of a means to potentially create an alternative that was past constitutional muster to maintain a status quo of segregation using public dollars, but in a private sector instead. Friedman's own sort of history with segregation, his own views on that are a bit complicated. In The Role of Government in Education, his essay introducing vouchers, he said, well, parents should have the right to do this. If they want to take these dollars and move to an all white school, they should be able to. And if they want to go to an all black school, they should be able to do that as well. I don't tend to get too much into what Friedman personally thought. What is inarguable and is part of the historical record is that segregationists sure liked this idea. The first modern program, though, resembling anything like this in any sort of current form that we're talking about, started in 1990. And in Milwaukee. And Friedman fairly quickly in the 90s became a real advocate for vouchers as his academic career was winding down. And later in life, he started something called the Milton and Rose D. Friedman Foundation, which is now an organization called EdChoice these days. And so he did transition late in life from a sort of an academic and a researcher and a thinker in the space to an advocate for these programs.
The argument for vouchers now, and maybe also historically, is couched in terms of freedom and parental choice and even parental rights.
Right.
Where does this concept come from, and why do you think it has such cultural resonance now?
Well, parents' rights were all over the 1950s responses to Brown v. Board, that phrase specifically. One voucher bill in Texas that never became law, but was famously, they attempted to pass it at that time, literally created a voucher system where parents would have to sign an affidavit saying the reason they were applying for and asking for this voucher is because of their dislike for racial integration. It was their right to do so, and so they were going to sign an affidavit to get this payment. That phrase, parents' rights, has some pretty nefarious origins in American history. Regardless of what the concept means to us today, that phrase stands in for that. Folks like Betsy DeVos, who I talk a lot about in the book, have made the idea of parents' rights a lifelong kind of rallying cry in some sense. She was behind a movement in the 90s to try to create so-called parents' rights constitutional amendments at the state level in a number of states. A parent's Bill of Rights is what she called it. Today, when you hear this phrase, it's often evoked by conservatives, and especially religious conservatives, around the issue of what's being taught in public schools and parents' ability to exit those public schools if they don't agree with what's being taught. All of that sounds sort of fairly well-meaning and non-controversial. Parents should and do have a say in public school curriculum and stuff. But it's important to sort of understand all of that in the context of some of the other conversations that are being had right now in American politics around the issues of what we teach about race, what we teach about and acknowledge in terms of gender, in terms of where students use the restroom in public high schools or other schools, where they use the locker room, things like that. All of these things kind of are all wrapped up in this ball of things called parents' rights today in 2024's version of it.
Yeah. So the intellectual basis for vouchers as a priority in conservative educational policy comes from a group of think tanks. And you've already mentioned the one that was started by Milton and Rose Friedman. And you also mentioned Betsy DeVos, who's also involved in funding some of these think tanks and research groups. Can you tell us more about these organizations? How, beyond the two we just mentioned, but how are they funded, and what are they trying to accomplish? Why is school choice so important to these groups?
Well, school vouchers are one form of school choice. And there are a number of other versions of this: charter schools, programs that allow parents to enroll kids in neighboring districts and things like that. But talking specifically about vouchers, these tax-funded private school tuition plans, the organizations, the big organizations, the Heritage Foundation, a group called the American Federation for Children, which is Betsy DeVos's kind of home group. She founded it. The Friedman Group, Ed Choice, the Cato Institute, which was founded by the Koch brothers. There's a bunch of big sort of foundations behind some of this stuff. But what they do is create kind of an intellectual framing basis. But at the end of the day, on the ground, on a day-to-day basis, what they do is they distribute a lot of information about these programs that advocates for them. The funding from all of this comes from deep-seated conservative foundations to talk about in the book, one called the Harriet and Lindy Bradley Foundation based in Milwaukee, Betsy DeVos and her family themselves, the Koch family themselves, and others that I talk about in the book. But those are some of the big players. What's important to understand about this activity is that it's all legal. It's all, in some sense, up and up. I mean, much of what I write about in the book is based on just simply publicly available information on tax documents and things. But what the activity is it is geared toward messaging, toward providing communication strategies, litigation strategies, legislative strategies to get bills through. While there's this kind of public-facing component to it that just says all of this is about grassroots parents mobilizing for the right to move their kids out of public schools, it's not really what's going on. What's really going on is there's been this longstanding, three-part strategy: again, communications, litigation, and legislation, that's sort of building the case for these voucher systems for the last 30 years. And that's what, a lot of has been written by other writers, other scholars, other journalists about these organizations that I just named. But sometimes it's hard to understand what's actually going on in the guts of these organizations and what they're doing. And that's what I'm trying to describe here. Is a lot of it is about building a case for these voucher systems and then taking it out for a spin and for public consumption.
And why do they want to do that? If it's not about the educational outcomes for the children, why do it?
Well, I do think that some of these groups, particularly the more secular groups, like Koch-oriented groups, the Koch brothers are famously non-religious in their activities. They would say this is about kids' academic outcomes to some extent. It's just that they don't work in those terms. They don't have strong academic outcomes. The real motivating push, at least this is the central case the book makes, is, as we've accumulated this evidence that vouchers are not helping kids academically over the last 10 years, well, what has really pushed this stuff forward? And my argument is that this is part of this larger sort of right-wing push to make America look a lot more like a Christian nationalist nation. This is why vouchers are two of the first three paragraphs in Project 2025's education chapter. This is why we're having this conversation, in a moment where we're still talking about book bans. We're talking about transgender issues. We're talking about, Ron DeSantis, who signed the biggest voucher bill in the country in Florida last year, within weeks of doing so, was on the record defending a curriculum in Florida's statewide curriculum that said that slavery had some benefits for African-American children because it taught some kids skills like blacksmithing. So why are we having these conversations in 2024 and not in 1890? Vouchers fit into this because some of these groups really do see I'll give an example. Betsy DeVos has said publicly that she laments the decline of what she sees as churches as centers of communities and being replaced by public schools as the centers of communities, and that she'd like churches to go back to being the centers of American communities. And so if you sort of see it from that angle, then it makes sense that the taxpayer-funded vouchers for religious schools would occupy a centerpiece of this plan. And then the last thing I'll say on all of this is, just a broader comment on what education means. It's an investment in the future, right? It's about children. And so if you are trying to build a long-term legacy and you are trying to kind of have an impact at the level of society and at the level of kind of 30 or 40 years from now, when you're gone and your kids are living in the world you helped make, then you are interested in education from day one, and that's where you put some of your time and money. So that's why that's why vouchers fits into some of these larger goals.
In the book, you compare the process of evaluating school voucher programs and then using those evaluations to defend them in court and justify the voucher programs as a cyclical process that mirrors the kind of no-bid defense contracts that companies like Blackwater, which is related to Betsy DeVos, it's her brother Eric Prince, I guess, founded it or runs it or both. And also Dick Cheney's firm, Halliburton, both of which were important partners for the government in Iraq and Afghanistan. So at first, this seems totally improbable to me. So can you explain what you mean? Like, what is the analogy between those no-bid contracts and what's going on right now in school?
The analogy comes from an analogy that I bring into the beginning of the book, which the first few pages, which is when I first started working on voucher evaluations, it was right up to and then including in the march to war in Iraq. And, whether through some personally formative years in that period of time or simply just understanding, and this is the case I make in the book, that's many of the right-wing think tanks behind the intellectual case for war in Iraq, for making this kind of neoconservative New World Order, saying that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and trying to build literally a case for invasion, are also, as it turns out, some of the same organizations, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, to name the first two, behind, on the domestic side, pushing for voucher systems in this country. So the analogies, both sort of in a literal sense, some of these are literally the same organizations. And so what happened after this march to war in Iraq? There are a lot of warning signs that in fact, it maybe was not the most advised thing to do, that maybe while Saddam was something of a threat, didn't have weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't like people didn't know this or didn't suspect this at the time. There was a big debate at this time, you probably remember, right? Just as there is a debate in the domestic scene right now about the wisdom and the value behind all kinds of domestic programs, whether from vouchers or anything else. But then when it happened, right, organizations came in and were charged with the aftermath, setting things up, security, logistics, building out infrastructure to kind of come in after the war began. And that's why I use that analogy, because in some sense, a lot of this does work the same way. There is a bill that gets passed, It's often put in a tentative or a pilot basis, a certain number of kids capped at a certain number of expenses, and with a deadline, with a 3-year period where it has to be evaluated, and then we see if we expand it 3 years later into a 5-year program, into a 10-year program, into a universal program, which is where we are today. The way that this worked in the early days was that they didn't just put out these blanket requests for proposals, is what we say in the business, an RFP, to any comer to kind of, just come in and see what's happening with these programs. In fact, it was the same group of folks working with the Friedman Foundation, working with the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, working with the Heritage folks or folks who are now there, who were advocating for these and then charged with evaluating them at the same time. And so that's where the analogy ends is, okay, this process of passing bills, evaluating them, and passing new bills is cyclical in that way. And it does sort of compare very directly to the way that kind of the rollout for the war in Iraq was made. The argument was made by some of the same folks who were then charged to sort of administer it when it came forward.
And I assume they're making quite a bit of money off of that process. Is that accurate?
I don't get into the profit side a whole lot because a lot of these are structured as nonprofits. I don't, Betsy DeVos is a billionaire. Charles Koch is a billionaire. There is profit to be had. And I do talk about sort of this at the end to some extent in the new versions of these programs. There are operators, there are middleman companies that distribute voucher funds for a fee. That didn't used to be the case 20 years ago when I first started on this. But what's really important to understand in all of this is a lot of these goals are ideological. They're not economic. They are really about diverting new dollars. That the dollars, in some sense, behind the public dollars, the public investments in these programs are about making a politics, making an ideology, not about cashing in on some huge new investment. Education's hard to do. It's expensive to do. It costs money to do education well, and so the real goal here is about trying to kind of make an American society that the folks behind these programs really want to see.
In the book, you go through a lot of the history of over the years, how things have changed. So maybe just take us through a little bit how the election of Barack Obama in 2008 changed the trajectory of voucher programs.
Well, there's two parts to that answer. So one, the election of Barack Obama was seen at that time, and I think to some extent still is seen today as something of a watershed moment in American politics. First and foremost, because we did elect our first Black president. That's just sort of inarguably a first. It was thought at the time that Obama was this, it was thought among conservatives that Obama was this far left. It's going to lead from a very far left position, and that he was going to, because of, say, the fundamental change that the Affordable Care Act brought into American politics and the economy, more or less guaranteeing or requiring people to have health insurance, that was such a big deal. There was some sense, at least in the education community, that Obama was going to make similar kind of changes in the education side. That didn't really end up happening. But symbolically, the nation's first Black president with a quasi Arabic or Muslim sounding name was a big deal, sort of in communities that were thought to be perhaps hostile to either of those ideas, a leader of color or certainly an international framing of American identity. And that's where, by the way, they don't really touch on this too much in the book, but this is where the Tea Party came out of, the famously sort of the economic populism that turns out had a lot of origins behind some of the same billionaire back groups I do talk about in the book. In education, Obama had a fairly conservative record. He introduced federal programs that incentivized the spread of charter schools, which do have a base of support that far exceeds school vouchers in general. Charter schools are independent public schools. They're not run by school districts, but they are public schools. Some progressives are opposed to them. He instituted an era of evaluating teachers on the basis of test scores, which was something deeply opposed by many of the teacher labor organizations. So Obama's record in real terms was somewhat mixed from a political perspective, but he certainly did not the messaging at the time, that was considered to be a step backward for the conservative movement, particularly after the Bush years, where some of these things all got started. Vouchers began at the federal level under George W. Bush, as did the Iraq War. But at the time, if you look back in 2008 or 2009, I don't know that we could have foreseen that just a few years later, Donald Trump was going to win the presidency and we were going to be in this moment today. It was quite a landslide that Obama won in 2008.
After that, we had another big change, which was when Donald Trump won the election in 2016 and then took office. So I want to talk a little bit about how that changed again. And one thing I want to bring back in, and I think it's relevant to this and also to the title of your book, The Privateers, meaning this is like a privatization effort. And so maybe you can tell us what happened when Donald Trump took office in 2016. And then what is this privatization that you're getting at with the title?
Yeah, so Trump really didn't have much of an education-related record to speak of. Not clear he had much of a record at all, honestly, on policy issues. But he did appoint Betsy DeVos Secretary of Education. Betsy DeVos had, up until that point, been famous specifically for her voucher efforts, her advocacy on behalf of these programs, her funding on behalf of these programs, and for deep skepticism about a federal role in education. And so putting someone with that profile in charge of the U.S. Department of Ed was controversial. In fact, Betsy DeVos had the narrowest confirmation vote of any Trump appointee in the original cabinet, just a 1-vote margin, because of all of those things I just listed. Even among Republicans, wasn't necessarily a popular figure. So Trump sort of putting Betsy DeVos in charge of the Department of Ed was akin to, sort of blessing this kind of increasingly right-wing version of education that up to and including vouchers, even though it wasn't clear what the U.S. Department of Ed could do from a policy perspective to create vouchers on their own. They couldn't do that, but messaging is important on this. And forgive me, the second part of your question
is about the privatization.
Yeah.
And the context, I'll just say, is that I spoke with someone who I know and who is in the public school system and asked, what is your sense of school vouchers? And she felt that they were specifically designed to try to privatize the public education system and to essentially kill public schools. So that's a very radical perspective on it, but that's part of the context I'm wondering about with your
that's correct. I mean, it is a very radical idea. Milton Friedman himself, getting back to the original part of the conversation, in the essay in which he introduced vouchers, he also said, ideally, government wouldn't have any role in education, not even vouchers, not even sending public dollars for private school. There wouldn't be any public resources devoted to education. It would be strictly left up to the parents. And so the political philosophy behind that, I would call, everyone's on their own. You don't, right? And so there is this larger debate about what is a public good. Is education something that has public value beyond simply the development of an individual child and the parent's role in that? Does it benefit society to have a child educated? Does it benefit democracy to have a child educated? Does it benefit the economy to have an educated worker? Those are questions that certainly transcend the narrow base of education that they get launched from, but they also are similar questions that are asked all over, the American economy and the American society. Is it collectively good to have healthcare for everyone? Is it collectively important to have childcare policy? Is another issue that gets talked about a lot today. Family leave, right? There's a lot of conversations about what government's sort of role in making these types of policies should be. Where we've answered it historically over the last 100+ years, at least in terms of education is concerned, is we're having public schools. We're having community schools that are run by communities, elected school boards from the communities. Parents are involved, parent-teacher organizations. In Texas, there are Friday night lights, right? The football is a major part of the community, as it is in many other places, right? So the publicness to education is sort of largely been without question, I think, for most people in general, at least up until now. But the other side on this question takes a much more private view of it, and that's where the title comes from. And that it's not about publicly contributing and raising citizens. It's not about the responsibility of communities to build themselves and to incorporate sort of the best of all of their members. That it's really just about the home, and it's really just about the church. And it's about the mother and the father and the traditional marriage, and that is the unit that we should be concerned about, is the marriage between a person that's born as a man and a person that's born as a woman, and their children as members of a church, and and that's the entity we should be talking about, not individuals, but marriages and churches. And that's it. And it's not really, there's nothing really public about it other than those few things. And that is the vision for education that gets translated through the voucher movement. It's absolutely about privatizing, not engaging in public school so much as this more private nature of education and contributions to community.
You've talked about religion and the role of religion here a couple of times in this. I want to spend another couple minutes on it. Yep. You've spoken about it a little bit in the context of public dollars that are essentially going to support a view that is very religiously based and or supports religious schools. And so that's a way to sort of break down a barrier that we currently have between church and state. This is one way to do that. There's also a sense in which you talk about the school vouchers as a faith-based exercise, meaning the idea that school vouchers work to educate children is a matter of faith and not a matter of evidence, meaning the evidence is showing that it doesn't work. And yet there's huge populations that still seem to believe that it's good for kids and good for families.
Yeah, well, in the conclusion of the book, one of the things I point to some quotes from some of the leading voucher proponents out there in the public sphere who've really started to say, let's just dismiss the whole conversation about academic outcomes at all. We don't get any traction when we talk about test scores anymore. We should be talking about this in terms of parents' rights, and that's it. And as I've argued in this conversation, parents' rights is a code and is a stand-in for a lot of these other things. But there certainly is a strand of all of this that really does see this as a faith-based activity. And a lot of the jurisprudence around the issue of vouchers in the last few years has followed that line of reasoning. I would argue it's a very conservative majority on the court that doesn't necessarily settle the issue once and for all, but they certainly have settled it for the near term. And they've said basically education is a faith-based activity, and religious education falls increasingly under the protection of religious exercise, meaning that parents should get to define what education is to them as a matter of their faith. And that all of these questions that we've talked about, do vouchers work at all? What kind of, all of that is sort of secondary or non-existent to the simple question of whether or not a parent wants to send their kid to a religious school. Do they have the right to public dollars to do so as an exercise of their faith tradition? And so when I make that point about vouchers being more about ideology and sort of belief at this point, not evidence, I've come to the conclusion that sort of, if evidence mattered in education, we've got enough in the historical record, in the research record against vouchers to have ended the conversation years ago. And yet they're still here. And they're not only here, but they're spreading. And so the question is, what is the motivating factor? It's not from people who really think these are improving test scores. It's from organizations that think along the lines I just said, that really this should be about religious education, and that parents have the right to use taxpayer dollars for that religious education. And it doesn't really matter what all the rest of it says, is the argument.
As we get to the end of our time, can you summarize for our listeners, what's the most important thing that you want them to take away from your book, or what action would you like to see as a result of it?
It's really important to understand that vouchers are not about academic opportunity for kids, and they're not about economic improvement for families. That at the end of the day, there is an argument to be had about vouchers along the lines of whether or not it is the right of parents to use public resources to attend religious schools. We could have that conversation, but overwhelmingly, manifestly, vouchers are not about academic opportunity for kids and families.
And what's next for you now that the book is out?
I'm going to keep writing and speaking about these issues, about the role of privatization in American society, religion in American education, thinking about what another book might look like in some of this space, more of a sort of a general audience, on perhaps on the role of again religion in education. But at the moment, still have a lot of work to do on the specific space of vouchers, and looking forward to doing it.
Great. And finally, what book do you recommend for our listeners?
Oh, such a great question. I would say well, my favorite book is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Recent book that I loved over the last year was Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. So I'll put those two names out there.
Okay, we'll put links to those in the episode notes. And
Great.
I think we'll leave it there for now. Josh Cowen, it has been a pleasure speaking with you today about the privateers, how billionaires created a culture war and sold school vouchers. Thank you for joining us on the New Books Network.
Such a great conversation. Thank you.